Think about the Holocaust. Think about the Gulag. Think about these just horrific things that were done to people, right? So I think if you pair an argument from evil with the type of evil that's horrendous, I think that's the strongest case against theism. You look around the globe, and theistic belief is so unevenly distributed. Like, isn't that like a probabilistic argument? That isn't that evidence that God doesn't likely exist? Because were God to exist, God loves all people. So wouldn't theistic belief be more evenly distributed around the globe? The life permitting universe is much more, much, 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 much more to be expected, giving a universe designer, than that the fact that this was all those constants just happen to fall perfectly in the range that you need to fall in, even though it's highly unlikely in order for this universe to have life. If you just say, if you're a naturalist, we got really lucky.
Hello and welcome to the Epitome. I'm your host, Nathan Bozeman. Today, I'm very excited. We have a special guest. We're going to talk with Dr. Christopher Cloos. How you doing today, Christopher?
Doing good. Thank you for having me.
Man, I've been excited to do this conversation because I love your channel. I love watching your content, and so I think this is going to be a great conversation. I do want to ask right off the top, I noticed that you changed the name. You used to have a different name, and you changed it, I think, just a few days ago. So you want to tell us a little bit about what happened and what you wanted to, the new direction, I guess, you wanted to take the channel?
Yeah, it's not necessarily a new direction, but it's just I don't want there to be any sort of hindrance or stumbling block to people engaging with my content. So, unfortunately, often in the church, philosophy has a bad connotation for whatever reason. I don't agree with that, but I figure I'll just go by my name, my own personal brand, and just make it more simple and clean that way.
Well, that's really cool. And I'm going to put a link in the description below for his channel. If you guys want to go check that out, I definitely recommend it. And I also wanted to ask for anyone that maybe is not aware of your work, could you tell us a little bit about your ministry, what the goal of your channel is, and things like that?
Sure. Yeah. So the goal of my channel is to strengthen faith through love and reason. So I believe that we're called to love God, love others. And I think one way we can do that is by the way we use our mind. We're also called to love God with all of our minds. So one goal of the channel is to help people sharpen their thinking, think more clearly about their faith so that they can grow stronger and more confident in what they believe. And the other goal would also be to equip believers to address some of the more challenging skeptics. So there are skeptics who are very philosophically savvy and inclined, and I do want to help believers sort of engage with them on a level that they will be respected and, do well, represent the faith well, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. First of all, because I think the two sides of that you gave were so important. First, you want to equip believers to, be more philosophically capable to defend their faith and just better in general. But then you also want them to be equipped against the more difficult challenges that might be raised against our faith. I think that's something I really appreciate about your work. I watched a video the other week that you had where you were discussing a new logical problem of evil. And I think a lot of people might have thought the logical problem of evil is dead. Like if you asked me like a few weeks ago, how's the logical problem of evil doing? I would have been like, well, I think it's gone, So the fact that you're having these conversations, I think is really cool. What actually got you interested in, philosophy of religion, apologetics, like this whole field that you're doing?
My background is in philosophy. So I did an undergrad in philosophy and then did a master's in philosophy and then got into a PhD program and did a PhD in philosophy. Now, originally, my philosophy sort of led me away from God. It didn't have to, but I was already on shaky ground. And then when I went to my undergrad program, Christianity in the university wasn't looked upon very highly. And so I sort of drifted even more, sort of became an atheist for quite a while. But then the ironic thing is when I went back and did my PhD, I found all these theists who were super sharp analytic philosophers, but also were amazing, like really sold out for Jesus. And I was like, wow. Now I had regained my faith prior to that, but it got me thinking, wow, I can really apply my skills, the things I've learned, to thinking deeply about the thing that matters most to me, which is my faith in Jesus.
Yeah.
So that was a big turning point for me.
Wow. I think that that's the journey for so many of us. I think when I first started having doubts with my faith, the apologetics and philosophy realm really helped me to be grounded in my faith. And specifically, I think what grounded me was studying history. You see Michael Lacona's big book right there, The Resurrection of Jesus and things like that. Just studying the history of Christianity was what really drew me back. But then, kind of like you, I found people like William Lane Craig and Richard Swinburne and some of these guys, and they really strengthened my faith even more. It's like, wow, I don't just have to defend it from history. I can talk about like the big philosophical questions and defend it as well. So it's kind of cool. It takes us on different journeys to bring us to himself. I wanted to ask you as well, since we're talking about these people that are giving good philosophical defenses of Christianity, like what would you say are like the best arguments for God's existence or for Christianity in particular? Which ones are like the most compelling to you?
Yeah. So just in the theism realm, I find the argument from fine tuning the most compelling. And it's also, ironically, one of the arguments that non-theists tend to find the most convincing, or at least gives them pause. So why I love that argument is because it's rooted in science. And so my background was in science. Before I became a philosophy major, I did all the bio, the chem, the physics. And so my background was in science, and then I got into philosophy. So I love that this argument combines science and with philosophy. But even more than that is just the facts that are in play in the fine-tuning argument. So there's this amazing example that Michael Rota gives in his from the edited volume, Contemporary Arguments in Natural Theology. So he says, imagine that there's this lottery, but it's a really weird lottery. So there's like all these cards printed, and there's numbers on the cards. Think of them like index cards, like 3x5 cards. There's only one winning number. Okay. So you buy a ticket, and then you get to select from this lottery one of the cards. Now, but here we got to imagine that the lottery organizer put the cards in cube boxes. Now, each box contains 15,000 cards. Okay. And then they place these boxes with the 15,000 cards in steel shipping containers. Each shipping container can hold 2,400 of those boxes. So you got 15,000 cards per box, and you got 2,400 in a shipping container. Now we can imagine they cover the entire surface area of Texas with 23 billion shipping containers.
Okay.
23 billion. Okay. And so the number of cards is like crazy. It ends up being like 840 trillion tickets, right?
Wow. Okay.
So you think, man, I think I can win this thing. So you get in a helicopter, you fly over Texas, and you go to what used to be San Antonio, because now it's all covered in shipping containers. So I think it's kind of no longer a state. It's just a giant lotto option. So you go over San Antonio, you select at random one shipping container, right? And then you start pulling the boxes out. Remember, there's 2,400. So you're just pulling boxes out, pulling boxes out, pulling boxes out. And then near the back of the shipping container, you pick out a box, and remember that each box has 15,000 cards. And then you select a card from that, and the number on your card reads some crazy long number. And then the employee says, "I'm sorry, you lost." And you're bummed. You're like, "Oh, I know my the odds were so low but I hope to have won." But there's a guy named Bob, and Bob is the next participant in this lottery. He gets the helicopter going. He flies over Corpus Christi this time, picks a shipping container, picks a box, and he picks a card from the box, and he wins. Mm-hmm. And then later, you're like, whoa, what is going on? How did this guy win? So later, you learn that Bob is the nephew of the computer programmer who's an employee of the lottery. So now, would you be suspicious?
Oh, 100%. I feel like this guy knew.
Right, exactly. So the basic sort of analogy there is like the life permitting character of the universe, the fact that this universe can permit life, given the constants are in such narrow, impossibly narrow ranges, they landed perfectly in the range that would permit life, is evidence for a universe designer, just like Bob's winning the lottery is evidence that he cheated. Mm. So the life permitting universe is much more to be expected, giving a universe designer, than that the fact that this was all those constants just happen to fall perfectly in the range they need to fall in, even though it's highly unlikely in order for this universe to have life. If you just say, if you're a naturalist, we got really lucky, like you flew over and you picked the right card from, So anyway, that's why I love that argument.
No, I'm the same way. I think the argument from design is intuitively so striking to me, because whenever you see the small range that the life permitting universe that we currently inhabit, when you see that such a tiny range, it just seems so intuitively obvious that there had to be some kind of intelligence behind it. But then also when you get into the minutia of the different things that were designed, I have this idea about water that I love to talk about, where it's like when the Earth was, kind of put together as a planet, there had to be an immense amount of water on it in order to move tectonic plates to build mountains. And then, the hydrological cycle where water goes up and, rains down and brings minerals to plants so that we could all live, right? It's like even the amount of water on our planet is a fine-tuned constant. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here, right? It's like even things like that where it's kind of like, that's very lucky. Like you said, if we're naturalists, right? If we're just wanting to believe that everything kind of just happened the way it did is kind of like a brute fact. So I think that kind of, to me, makes the design argument even more intuitive when you get into like, let's talk about the gravitational force and talk about how fine-tuned it is, or how many earthquakes are on the Earth, or like things like that even are so seem so fine-tuned for life as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. It looks like our universe is just, even not getting into the minutia, like you say, it looks like things are designed. And, that's also the teleological argument writ large, which it's a whole family of arguments. The fine-tuning argument is one such teleological argument, arguing for design. But one other really fascinating constant that's often mentioned is the cosmological constant. Yeah. So this is the constant that governs how fast our universe is expanding. Okay, now here's the crazy thing about it. If it were negative number, our universe would collapse. Nothing would have come about. The universe just would have collapsed in on itself. If it were just even a tiny bit a negative number, it also would have gone towards shrinking, and eventually nothing would have come out. If it was a positive number, if it went too fast, if it was too high of a positive number, it would just expand too fast and nothing also would come about. But the number is, I think it's 1.35 times 10 to the negative 123
Yeah.
positive. So in other words, it's not zero, but it's so close to zero, but it's just enough in order for the whole universe to properly expand such that this universe could be life permitting.
Yeah.
And this has baffled physicists. They're like, why isn't it just zero? They're like, why is it just perfectly right off, impossibly close to zero, but not zero? If it was zero also, this wouldn't have happened. So anyway, that's another example of fine tuning that's kind of mind blowing.
Yeah, the fine tuning argument is the strongest one for me as well. I think that the intuition to a designer rather, is so strong for me. I also think cosmological arguments are very strong for me because the impossibility of an actual infinite, like these kinds of things, just seems so intuitively strong for me that I don't know. It just seems to me that it's impossible that the universe went back an infinite time, and so therefore we need some sort of unmoved mover, so to speak, right? And I think that I wanted to ask you this as well. This is kind of just off the top of my head as I'm thinking about it. An argument can be strong, I think, in two ways, and I want to see if you agree with this, that it can either be strong based on the evidence for it, but also I like to gauge the strength of an argument based on how bad the arguments or responses to it are. Like when I hear responses to the fine-tuning argument, that makes me more confident in how strong it is because I don't find them to be at all strong. And the same thing with cosmological arguments. When I hear someone try to give a response to a cosmological argument, typically I find them very contrived and ad hoc, and that makes me like, okay, well, this seems to be a pretty strong argument if that's the best you've got, you know? Would you say that that is something that when you're trying to gauge how strong an argument is, do you think like gauging the responses is one way to tell?
Yeah, I would say that is some. I wouldn't put a ton of stock in it because could be just that we haven't thought hard enough yet. It could be that the argument's too new. It could be, in other words, I wouldn't think it'd be the final chip. But if you're saying, is that a good gauge and sort of guide? Then I would say, yeah, it can be. Like, for instance, the fine tuning of the universe, the multiverse hypothesis, is the biggest objection. And when you look at the multiverse, it just quickly becomes evident. Well, you need a multiverse generator, and then when you look at the multiverse generator, that's got to be fine tuned to generate all these universes. So, yeah, that is an interesting point, actually. I hadn't thought of that. So that can be a good guide to potential strength of an argument, how bad the responses are. But I would caution putting a lot of stock into it, because often as things progress, the objections get better. But if it's an argument that's been around a long time and the objections are just bad, then I would say it perhaps deserves even more stock for that base reason.
Yeah, I think someone might want to say like that's a non sequitur, like the arguments against it are bad, therefore it's true. And I would say, yes, I'm not making that argument. I'm not like deductively saying that, the arguments are bad, therefore it's true. I'm kind of just saying like, well, if the world's best minds are trying to come up with responses and they can't, it seems to me like, okay, well, we should at least put a little bit. It should be some kind of consideration we put into our analysis. Like, okay, the responses to it don't seem to be very compelling at all, and the argument itself seems very intuitionally strong. Like, again, the inference to a designer is very strong for many, many people. Like you said, even naturalists think this is the best argument. So I think that when you have such a strong intuition and then the responses aren't so great, it's like, okay, well, maybe that should at least be part of our analysis. Well, I want to.
Oh, and just one other thing on that point. I think there is a way to actually relate it directly to the argument. So after you have a deductively valid argument or you have an inductively strong argument, now you got to defend the premises, right? So if your defense of the premises is really easy, because you can knock down all the objections, then it is more likely that the premises are true. And therefore, in a deductive argument, it would be sound. So it'd be easier to defend the soundness of a deductive argument. And then the other side would be cogent. So you would have an inductively cogent argument if you could, defend the truth of the premises. So I think there is a way of tying it in directly to the truth value as well, because it'd be easier to defend.
Okay. Do you mind explaining a little bit what inductively cogent, I think is what you said? Could you explain a little bit about what that means?
Yeah. So an argument's inductively strong if given the truth of the premises, it makes more likely than not, say above 50%, the truth of the conclusion. Mm. And that differs from a deductive argument, because a deductive argument, assuming the truth of the premises, the truth of the conclusion necessarily follows. So in a way, an inductive argument is probabilistic, and in a way it's weaker because the truth of the conclusion isn't entailed by the truth of the premises, assuming they are true. But in an inductive argument, you have the truth of the premises making the conclusion likely. But the ironic thing is there's sort of been a shift in thinking in the apologetics landscape away from deductive arguments, more towards inductive arguments. And here's the reason: because they're more modest. Mm. So you're just saying, given these things, this thing is likely, as opposed to given these things, this thing must follow, right? So it's much easier to defend something where you're being more modest and you're saying, given the truth of these things, this is more likely, as opposed to given the truth of these things, this must follow.
Interesting. No, thank you for explaining that. I just noticed that maybe someone in the audience might not have known what inductively cogent means. Yeah. So just for everyone listening. And I wanted to go a little bit in the opposite direction now, because, we've been talking about our strongest considerations for God. But now let's ask the exact opposite question. What do you think is the strongest evidence against theism?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's divine hiddenness is one that's really good. And we can talk about that later. The other one that is, I think, the most difficult is any argument involving horrendous evil. So Marilyn McCord Adams originally sort of coined the term, and something is horrendously evil when it's so bad that it makes it reasonable to think that one's life on the whole wasn't good. Mm-hmm. So either the participation in this evil so bad, or you had this evil done to you, and it makes it to where it's really a good question whether your life on a whole was good because this horrible thing happened to you, right? So think about the Holocaust, think about the Gulag, think about these just horrific things that were done to people, right? So I think if you pair an argument from evil with the type of evil that's horrendous, I think that's the strongest case against theism. And you mentioned the logical problem of evil, and that was Jim Sturba's argument. He focuses on horrendous evils and says, look, God should have eliminated these things. Okay, yeah, for soul making, we need some bad, but like, really? The Gulag? Really? The Holocaust? Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of a sketch of what I think is the strongest evidence against theism.
Speaking of the problem of evil, I read Pat Flynn's book, The Best Argument for God, recently, and I thought his treatment of the problem of evil was very interesting. I'd never seen this approach before, so I wondered what you thought of it, since you recently had him on your channel as well. He discussed how atheists and naturalists kind of have this prior thing that they have to explain, like consciousness or psychophysical harmony, which would make it even more difficult for them to explain suffering. He kind of says, okay, let's take for granted that naturalism's true. Well, what reason do we have to believe that our mental states are reliable, like what kind of talking about material and how if we are just matter, like why would we think that our thoughts are reliable? These kinds of questions that we kind of ask prior to even getting to suffering itself. What do you think of an approach like that, as opposed to like trying to maybe dismantle the premises themselves?
Yeah. So ironically, Pat Flynn and I talked so long, we had to stop our conversation, and we were going to pick back up and talk about the problem of evil, but we just haven't had a chance yet. So I am going to, at some point, talk to him in more detail about it. And I originally sent him notes on it, and so it's been a little while since I've looked at his take, but I do think that's interesting. And what I would want to hear more of is why these prior issues like psychophysical harmony, maybe nomenological harmony. I can't remember exactly what he brings in, why that in particular would put the theist on a better playing field or position when they're then addressing evil. So perhaps you could kind of make the connection, and then I'll share a little more.
Yeah, so I think he was trying to, and I don't want to say that this is Pat Flynn's view. So for all the people watching, I'm not Pat Flynn, so I'm just going to try to do my best to kind of make the connection here. So he's basically wanting to say that if naturalism were true, then we don't really have a reason to think that, first of all, suffering, that there would, I think he says that there could be no suffering, a little less suffering, or a lot more suffering. And so a theist or an atheist or a naturalist is going to have a hard time explaining why we have this much suffering as well. And they would have a hard time. They would also have a hard time explaining the psychophysical harmony behind it, like why when I stub my toe, that hurts, and I now have avoidance behavior that I have to go through, and these kinds of things. And it seems that on theism, that makes sense, that when I stub my toe, it's like, hey, I shouldn't want to do that. But with psychophysical harmony, we don't really have a reason to think that our mental and physical states would coincide. And so suffering itself seems kind of odd on naturalism, like the amount that we have, as well as our experience of it and our response to it. So that's kind of, I think, his approach.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I like that, because psychophysical harmony is a strong argument. And so one of the things you need to account for if you're looking at the problem of evil, I think, is the necessity of pain. And it seems like, from how you're sketching it, it seems like that would put you in a really strong position, because it'd be more likely that the mental state of the experience of pain, or conscious awareness of pain, and the brain state would be linked to allow us to avoid things, and to have, do stuff that's better for our well-being. So I can see the value in that.
Yeah, and I have to say, for me, because I asked you earlier about what the best argument against God, or the best evidence against God. For me, it's been the problem of divine hiddenness. The problem of evil is definitely a strong one. I know that for most people, that's the strongest one. But for me, I've had times in my life where I've just been like, God, where are you? And then I know that those, Richard Dawkins and Alex O'Connor, I've heard them bring up this idea of like, well, people all over the world are born in different countries and they never even hear about Jesus. And so if Jesus is God, why would he not want those people to know who he is? And so for me, divine hiddenness has always been the hardest one for me to grapple with. And I think on your channel, you've done a lot of great work on divine hiddenness. And so I wanted to ask you, like, what do you think are the best responses to the problem of divine hiddenness?
Well, actually, what's sort of ironic about that is I'm literally working on a defense right now, in dialogue with Justin Schieber of Real Atheology. So we're currently going back and forth just in written form, and then we're going to eventually go on a channel and read our debate. But the defense that I'm developing is called the holiness defense. So this idea comes from the work of Mark Murphy and his book, Divine Action and Divine Holiness. And Mark Murphy points out, after he develops his view of holiness, he notices that the default position, if we're accounting for God as holy, is that God would maintain distance, because God, part of his holiness is that God is majestic, God is wholly other, God is transcendent, God is awesome, amazing. And then the other part of holiness is moral purity. So God is undefiled, God is totally pure. So if you think about us, we're not majestic. We're very limited in power and abilities. And then we're sinful. We're prone to all sorts of bad stuff. So for God to enter into an intimate relationship, and that's what's on the table with the hiddenness argument, is a personal relationship. Schellenberg talks about a conscious, reciprocal, meaningful relationship. For God to enter into that, it seems God has reasons that require him to keep distant, right? Um, so that's just part of it. So God has a requiring reason, that is a reason that on pain of irrationality, he should sort of heed. That is, were he to enter into a personal relationship with us without a good reason to the contrary, he would be acting irrational given his holiness. So this sort of flips the script on the argument, because the argument is that if God exists, God is all loving. If God is all loving, God's always open to a personal relationship with any person at any time. And so if that's the case, there won't be people who really want to know God, really want a relationship with God, and yet don't believe he exists. You won't find those non-resistant non-believers. And this says, no, God will actually, it makes sense that there would be non-resistant non-believers given that God is holy. And then I also pair that with love. So I do think love and holiness are a package.
Yeah.
But that's at least one defense that I'm working on that I think is pretty powerful, and it hasn't really been explored much.
Yeah, that's probably, first of all, I want to say that's really good. But second of all, I think that that's so far from what I've seen from Schellenberg and others, that's probably my favorite route to go as well, is to say, okay, well, if we just analyze God's love, then yeah, it seems kind of puzzling. But once you bring in other attributes like holiness and transcendence and other things, it starts to make a little bit more sense. And so to me, it seems like the biggest error of the divine hiddenness argument is that it wants to kind of isolate God's love in a vacuum, and then
Yes, yeah.
to the exclusion of his other attributes. But it seems like we can't do that. It seems like we have to bring all of God for all that he is. And because it seems to me, if the divine hiddenness argument is going to work or show some sort of contradiction in God's nature and divine hiddenness, then it seems like you need to analyze all of God, not just one attribute.
Yeah, that's very perceptive. And there's a way I didn't mention, but prior to this, I say Schellenberg's committed to this because he thinks that God is the ultimate being. And how is God ultimate? God is metaphysically ultimate in terms of power and existence, ontology. God is axiologically ultimate. God is the ultimate source of value and goodness. And God is soteriologically ultimate. That is, God is the ultimate source of, you think of salvation, he's thinking of it like source of personal sort of fulfillment. And a savior can also give that to us. So I basically say, look, if this is your view of God, then you have to accept that God's holy, because part of God being axiologically ultimate is being morally pure, morally undefiled, and part of being metaphysically ultimate is being majestic and transcendent. So I tied it even more to Schellenberg, say he's committed to this as well. But your general point is definitely, that's my motivation. I think we need to think about all of God. And if we just isolate a particular attribute and say, this is what defines God or in this particular way or in this particular thing, then of course you're going to get out of it what you want, right? And I'm not saying people are going into it thinking that, but if you just have this focus on love to the exclusion of God's other attributes, then it does make sense that you would think non-resistant non-believers is a reason to think God doesn't exist, as opposed to, well, non-resistant non-believers is just sort of to be expected given that God's holy.
Mm. Oh yeah, and I did want to mention one thing. You said that you're working on this in a back and forth between you and what was his name one more time?
Justin Schieber.
Justin Schieber from Real Atheology. I really recommend anyone watching this to also check out Real Atheology. I think their content is really good. And I actually have been watching this back and forth between you and him. And one of the responses you gave in one of your videos, you'll probably remember this. It was, you said that God doesn't just want us to be in relationship with him. He wants us to have he doesn't just want us to know that he exists. He wants us to be in relationship with him. And so there might be some people, and some will even openly admit this, that if God revealed himself to them right now, they still wouldn't worship him. And so God is justified in not revealing himself or making himself known to someone if they're not prepared to worship him and be in right relationship with him if he were to make himself known. And so, because I think a lot of the argument as well is this idea that, oh, well, I don't believe that God exists. And if I don't believe God exists, then how could I possibly come into a relationship with him? And I think one of your responses to that I thought was very, very sharp there, where you said, God doesn't just want us to know he exists. He wants us to worship him. And if someone's heart isn't prepared to worship him, then it might be better, actually. It might even be more loving of God to not reveal a knowledge of himself in this moment to that kind of person.
Yeah, I think you're referring to the better start objection. And the idea is if God's really all loving, then why wouldn't God, in some cases, wait for the person to come around so they're in a better position to enter into the relationship for the right reasons? Yeah. So if were he to reveal himself, his existence, then yeah, I guess on some level, now you're starting a personal relationship. But wouldn't it be better if God waited to reveal his existence to that person until they were perhaps had a softer heart, or they were, ready to, as you mentioned, worship God and accept God for all of who God is and what God has done for them, as opposed to just we're kind of in a relationship. And Schieber's point is just get the relationship started because it's so valuable. And then you can, God can sort of work on their heart and stuff like that. But relationships have a trajectory. That's another point that I make. And so if you start on a bad foot, God could do all sorts of things within the relationship, and it may or may not change their heart. So perhaps it would have been more loving in specific cases to wait until that heart was soft and ready, and then started on a better footing, and then also hopefully lead to a better trajectory as well.
No, that's really good. And I think I watched Gavin Ortland. He did a response to the divine hiddenness argument because, like I said, this has been the strongest argument for me against God. This is to me, the most intuitionally troubling one for me over and above evil. But he said as well that sometimes that he gave this analogy between a couple, like someone that you want to date, someone that maybe you've fallen in love with them from a distance or something. But maybe that they're not ready for a relationship, that they just got out of a bad relationship or something. And it might not be the loving thing to do to reveal that you have a desire to be in a loving relationship with them in that moment because of the situation they're going through. And so it's actually sometimes the loving thing to do to restrain and to make yourself known to them later and to make your feelings known to them later. And so I think a lot of these considerations can have helped me at least to deal with this intuitional pull I have with the divine hiddenness argument. Because, when I first heard that argument, I was like, wow, that seems really plausible. It seems, and like I said, I had dealt with moments in my life where I was like, where are you, God? You seem so hidden. So, but the cool thing about that is, and this is something I loved about Ortland's treatment of it as well, is he went to Kierkegaard and to the Psalms, and we, like King David, had moments where he was like, where are you, God? And and then we have Soren Kierkegaard talking about how doubt and faith are like sisters. part of having a relationship with God is having doubt. It all comes with it. And so I think when we take all of these things into account, again, when we don't isolate like one thing and we kind of take the whole picture into account, these questions can be put to rest.
Yeah, and I think Schellenberg's argument is deductive. So going back to what we were talking about earlier, but there are other versions of the hiddenness argument that aren't quite as talked about, but are pretty strong, and so they're inductive. Stephen Mason gives a hiddenness argument from the idea that like, and recently Cosmic Skeptic or Alex O'Connor put this on his channel. You look around the world and it's like, does God hate India? Does God hate Thailand? Because there's like Thailand, there's like, very small percentage of people who are monotheists. And then within that group, very small percentage of people who are Christians living in Thailand. So like you look around the globe and theistic belief is so unevenly distributed. Like, isn't that like a probabilistic argument? That isn't that evidence that God doesn't likely exist? Because were God to exist, God loves all people. So wouldn't theistic belief be more evenly distributed around the globe? So I just mentioned that because that's another sort of one that is still pretty tricky and Schellenberg's is still tricky. Don't get me wrong, and it deserves our full attention. But I just want to mention that there are these other versions as well that are not deductive arguments, but they're inductive arguments, and they can be pretty strong as well.
Well, just off the top of my head, hearing that, I've never heard that objection before, but just to maybe throw an idea out there, what do you think of saying something like, maybe that's a generational thing? In the Bible, we see different ideas of like generational blessings. Like if you serve God, it'll be like generational where they'll serve God too, because you pass that on to your children. So it could be the case that for a lot of countries, they've had generations of people. Maybe they had an opportunity generations ago to accept Christianity, but they rejected it. And then that was passed on and passed on and passed on. And so maybe we shouldn't blame God, but maybe there was some finite person in the finite past that passed this on, and this is the effect of that. And so now it's up to us as Christians to spread the gospel to them anew, so that a new generation of believers could begin.
That's interesting. I've never heard of that. And one way of sort of adding to that is that you might say, and others have talked about this in response to Schellenberg's argument as well, like we have a responsibility to share the good news with others, to share the love of God that, and knowledge of God that we've been given. And that's a great good.
Yeah.
So from what you were suggesting, like, yes, there's been these generations of perhaps have perpetuated non-theistic belief, but there's a great good there, namely that we have a responsibility to share the knowledge of God. And were there not those pockets of cultures and people, we wouldn't have an opportunity to do that. Yeah. And so it kind of brings evangelism back into the fold in a really strong way. And like you said, it sort of takes the pressure off God, because God allowed culture to develop how it did. And some people freely chose to reject him. And maybe that set the trajectory in certain ways for a certain culture. I guess, as I'm talking about it, the only problem I see is that monotheism is relatively recent in terms of a development. So I guess there would still need to be some work done on why God didn't reveal himself as in the monotheistic sense earlier, to give those people a chance as well. Because if they develop, like, for instance, if they developed an animistic culture, like God is in nature and they have these sense of like forces and such, but they don't believe in a creator, all good, loving creator, then you could see that would set the trajectory in a negative way, right?
Yeah.
At least in with regard to theistic belief. Like that could perpetuate that, and a whole culture could come out of that. And it wasn't necessarily a choice to reject God, if you know what I mean. So there you have like just somebody finding themselves in an environment, finding themselves with beliefs, and it sort of progressed that way without anyone consciously rejecting the monotheistic God.
That's a really interesting point. Yeah. And I was thinking as you were talking, I loved the point you made about responsibility, because I think that this is a part of it, almost ties in the problem of evil as well, because we have this range of, or let me go back for a second. We have freedom, and we have the ability to make morally significant choices in the theistic world, right? And that's kind of the range we would expect if God exists, that you and I would be significantly free moral agents that can make morally significant decisions. And so because we have that range, first of all, in regards to the problem of evil, that's the range we would expect if God exists, that people would be able to have soul building and people would be able to make decisions that are good and evil. But then in the problem of divine hiddenness, the way it applies to that is that we now have a responsibility as Christians to go spread the gospel. And I love that you said that, because if everybody in the world was a Christian, or if everybody in the world already believed, there would almost be nothing for us to do, right? Just kind of be like, oh, well, we don't really have a mission. The scriptures tell us, the Great Commission, like, go spread the gospel to all nations. It's like, that would be a null and void verse at this point, because everyone's a Christian. And, that's the ultimate hope of the world. And that's what we hope for in the new heavens and the new earth one day, that we will ultimately all be believers and living in a world full of believers. But it would almost, the idea of responsibility, I guess, is what I was latching onto. This idea that because God's given us this responsibility, we're called to preach the gospel. And so that's on us as Christians to go make his name known.
And if people want, on that point, if people want to look at that exact defense against Schellenberg's argument, Richard Swinburne has given what's called the responsibility response. And then also there's a great Dustin Crummett has also done work on it, and Travis Dumsday have done work on it. Sort of taking what Swinburne said about us having responsibility to share God with others, and then sort of connecting that to like how we have a deep responsibility to do this. And were there not, as you mentioned, were there not non-resistant non-believers or people who are open to the gospel but haven't heard about it, then or haven't been gripped by it, then we wouldn't, that good wouldn't exist. The good of taking responsibility for others and loving them by sharing the good news with them.
Absolutely. If someone is still watching up to this point, we're about, almost an hour, about 10, 15 minutes away from an hour into this. They're probably really into these conversations, into the divine hiddenness conversation, the problem of evil conversation, arguments for God. And that's something that I love that you do about your channel. So I want to encourage anyone still watching to go check out Dr. Cloos' channel, because he is having these kinds of conversations on a regular basis. I actually, to bring up the logical problem of evil again, he had a philosopher on to talk about that. I think you guys were talking for about 2 hours or something. I was listening to that. You had another philosopher on who he brought on, I think it was the problem of evil for atheists, which was a very interesting conversation. And so there's a lot of other conversations. Are there any other conversations you want to shout out that you've had recently on topics like this? Or are those the main two?
Those are the most recent. So it's called the Coffee with Philosophers podcast. And like you said, I reach out to people who are working in these areas on these topics and invite them on. And sometimes they say yes. And we have fun conversations because there's really fascinating work going on. It's amazing. And I want people to know about all this great work that Christian philosophers and theologians are doing. And so, definitely go check it out.
Yeah, for those two interviews would be great for the problem of evil, and then for the problem of divine hiddenness, just go check out that back and forth between him and Justin from Real Atheology, and that'll really get you guys in the weeds on these different arguments. And then also, when do you think that new video will come out on the holiness objection? Like,
Oh,
if someone's
that's a good
watching this in the
question.
future, if someone's watching this in the
Yeah.
future, it's already out. Go check it out. But if you're watching this upon upload, when do you think they could expect it?
I don't know exactly because we're finishing up the back and forth. So we each presented an opening statement.
Mm.
Then Justin responded to my opening statement. And then I just responded to him. And I think I don't know how many more rounds we're going to do of that, but it should be before the end of the year that we then go on a channel and actually present it and kind of have the debate. We're going to read through part of it and then probably have a open discussion or Q&A period as well. So I would say before the end of the year, hopefully.
All right, so we're filming this in November of 2024. So if you're watching, beyond December, January, definitely go check out those discussions on the problem of divine hiddenness. That back and forth is going to be really cool. I'm looking forward to that, especially the holiness objection you just brought up. I think that's really, really cool. Speaking of the discussions you have on your channel, though, you're speaking with a lot of guys that are in the academy, the ivory towers, and I want to ask you, do you think, or I guess since you are doing it, why do you think it's important for lay Christians like myself or someone else to kind of be interested in what's going on in the ivory towers?
Well, there's several reasons. Number one, we're called in Scripture to have a defense for our faith.
Yeah.
And if we're not aware or keeping up with what's going on in the academy, we're going to come up against people like a Justin Schieber, and they're going to be really savvy, and we're going to give them responses or arguments from the 1980s. And they'll look at us with puzzlement and say, wow, where have you been for 30, 40 years?
Yeah.
So even if you're not into the weeds as we are, it's just important in general to have a sense of where things are going, so that if you're going to dialogue online with others or even in person, if people have doubts like about hiddenness, you can have a sense of assurance that you've sort of settled it. You might not have figured out everything, but you've settled it for yourself. And then when you engage with people, either in the pews or online, you can talk from a place of confidence, and you can talk from a place that's really knowledgeable. And that can often help people not deconvert. There's this whole deconversion movement. And when I watch some of their videos, I'm like, oh, there's good answers to this. Yeah. Now, deconversion is there's a whole host of reasons why people deconvert.
Yeah.
So I don't want to pretend like it's one, just an intellectual argument, but often the intellectual reasons they give, countering Christianity, countering God's existence, are not very well thought out. And so if you had someone come to you who was wrestling with their faith, wrestling with doubts, which is fine to wrestle with by all means, but then they're going towards deconversion, perhaps you can help save them by saying, look, there's all these great resources for these great questions you're asking. People have good answers to what you're going through. And perhaps that could save them from walking away from the faith. So I think that's another reason why it's important to sort of stay up to speed with what's going on in the academic literature, even if you don't read every journal article.
I think one of the first things you said was really crucial. You said that they might be giving really out-of-date responses. One thing I noticed while watching your channel, when I'm watching philosophers who are putting out new arguments, I noticed just how different the conversation is in the ivory tower than it is on the ground. And I think that is something I've noticed, because arguments kind of take time to make its way down into the collective consciousness, as a lot of sociologists call it, like make its way down to the average person. And so the arguments that are being discussed are so different. Like, for example, when you had that discussion on your channel, I'll keep shouting it out, and I'll put a link in the description below if you want to go check it out. The argument or the problem of evil for atheists, how he drew this distinction between the deontological and the axiological problem of evil, and then was like, yeah, the deontological version, like, that's a theist problem because God would have to have moral obligations. But let's talk about the axiological problem of evil, like the values themselves, and see how it might actually, the theist can kind of have all of the naturalist resources for explaining it, and then on top of that having theistic resources. And it's like, wow, that's a really cool argument. And you would never hear that on the ground because the conversation is so different on the ground.
That's a great point. Yeah. That is a shift, right? So I think there is like Kyle Olander, Tim Howard as well. They're shifting towards towards a more inductive approach and axiological, more value-based. And actually, what's ironic is I was just watching a discussion between Gavin Ortland and Matt Fradd on Pints with Aquinas. And Gavin made a good point. They were sort of talking back and forth, and sort of came up that a lot of what people in the pews are wrestling with, and what might be more attractive to people today, is more the values question. So, like, okay, the truth question is important, and all these arguments are supposed to get at whether it's true or not, God exists, whether it's true, Jesus rose from the dead, whether it's true, blah, blah, blah. But, like, why does it matter for my life? Would it be a good thing if Christianity were true? Setting aside whether it is true, is it a net valuable thing for our world and for my life? And so that's where I think also there's a lot of important work to be done. And ironically, I've done work on the meaning of life in that regard. So if you want, I could share on that briefly.
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
Yeah. So this is a good example to illustrate what you were saying, the shift towards values. So in that argument, now, if you go online, you'll see William Lane Craig, do this meaning of life argument, where basically, like, it's a deductive argument. And basically, if God doesn't exist, there's no meaning. They're like, it's super strong. And people are like, when I am in a relationship with my significant other, that gives me meaning. I have a dog, that gives me meaning. I have family members, they give me meaning. And so instead of saying it's all or nothing, either God exists and there's meaning in life, or God does not exist and there's no meaning in life, what about an argument that says, given God's love, we were talking about love earlier, God's love makes like a whole lot more meaningful. So this kind of it ties into this, like, theists, we have your resources and more, right?
Yeah.
So we have all the love in the world, and plus we get this meaning from God's love that God gives us, and that we get to reciprocate and give back to God and give to others. So the basic argument is that God's love makes life maximally meaningful, as opposed to just kind of meaningful.
Yeah.
And that might be more attractive, right?
Yeah. And I was going to say, like, God might make life ultimately meaningful, while on the naturalist worldview, it's like there's no ultimate meaning. There might be like a subjective meaning, like you were talking about with your dog or your significant other. But with God, we get this extra layer of meaning that's ultimate. Like, there's some ultimacy to it, and some finality, maybe. So we've been talking a lot about these more philosophically rigorous arguments, and some of the reasons to get into the common, or not common, current arguments for what philosophers of religion are talking about today with the problem of evil and problem of divine hiddenness. I wanted to ask if you could just give one pitch to someone watching, and they want to know, why should I I guess, care what's going on in the ivory towers? Why should I care about these arguments for God? Why is it important for a layperson like me or someone else to get involved into understanding these arguments so that they can? Is it so they could share their faith more? Is it so they can answer their questions? Like, is it a combination of all that? What would be your pitch?
My mm, my pitch would be, the more you understand about God, the more you will, with clarity, be able to talk about God, and the more you will understand the God you worship. If you not only, of course, study scripture, of course, study systematic theology, of course, but if you want to sharpen your mind and understand the big questions, why is there something rather than nothing? What's the meaning of life? These sorts of things, then you're going to have to get into the philosophical literature. And I mean, one of the greatest theologians in history, St. Augustine, was also an amazing philosopher. He read Plato, and took on a lot of Platonic things. So I would just say, if you're in the pews, it can be daunting. So let me just say this. When you first start studying philosophy, and in philosophy of religion, philosophical theology, it will sound crazy, but
Yeah.
keep with it. Just keep going, and it will strengthen your faith by you studying it. And just keep going, and you'll get better at it as you go.
hmm I think that's exactly right. And do you have any resources you'd recommend, maybe for a beginner, maybe even someone more intermediate or more advanced? Like, do you have any resources you'd like to recommend to anyone?
Sure. If you're just getting started, I really recommend Richard Swinburne's thin book called Is There a God?
Mm,
That's a great resource. He's made accessible his masterwork, The Existence of God. So I recommend Richard Swinburne's Is There a God? And then if you want to get into philosophical theology, I recommend Stephen Davis and Eric Yang's introductory text, Christian Philosophical Theology.
mm,
And then if you want to get into Christian apologetics, there's an excellent text I just found, and I'm working on creating a small group study on this text for my church. It's called Stand Firm by Gould, Dickinson, and Lofton.
mm.
Stand Firm. So if you want to do apologetics, I'd do Stand Firm. If you want to get more into like views of the atonement, views of the Trinity, and so on, do Davis and Yang's Christian Philosophical Theology. And then if you want to do philosophy of religion, do Swinburne's Is There a God?
I just looked up the book Stand Firm. Is it Apologetics and the Brilliance of the Gospel with Good
Yep.
Dickinson? Okay, I'm definitely going to get that book. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm taking notes here
great.
too, guys. I'm taking notes here too. I want to learn more. And by the way, I'll put a link in the description for all those books that he recommends. So if you're thinking, okay, I want to grab those books, I'll let you guys grab those below. Dr. Christopher, is there anything else you want to talk about before we head out? Or is there any other topics that maybe we haven't discussed yet that you'd like to discuss?
One thing we haven't discussed, and I'll just briefly mention it, is the moral argument.
Mhm.
And this ties into kind of everything we've said. So there's a version of the moral argument that's out there due to William Lane Craig that is not as well regarded by atheists who are philosophically savvy. But there are versions that are very strong. I won't go into all of it, but I just want to mention that if you hear the moral argument, often from C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity, and then sort of filtered down through William Lane Craig and others, just know that there's stronger versions of the moral argument out there. And those versions are inductive. And specifically, there's the argument from moral knowledge. So it's sort of related to psychophysical harmony. It's like on naturalism, why would we expect to have moral knowledge? We would just get knowledge to survive. And so that's another one of those arguments I recommend. So the sort of more flat-footed argument from Bill Craig is flat-footed because it doesn't address all the atheistic theories in metaethics that can account for objective moral values. So I just kind of throw that out there. And I'll give you a little tip. From what I understand, Baggett and Walls, are you familiar with them?
I just grabbed their book off the shelf.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah, when you were talking about that, I was like, oh, I have their book right behind me.
That's funny. So they're supposedly going to be completing their trilogy. I think there was Good God, God and Cosmos.
Yep.
And so that's forthcoming. We're November 2024. But if you're watching this in the future, check out their book as well. It should be excellent.
Yeah, I've read God and Cosmos. I didn't actually know when I got the book that it was part of a series. And so I have Good God. So I've read God and Cosmos, this book I just showed on the screen. I have Good God behind me. I haven't read it yet, though. So I didn't want to put it on the screen because I don't want to, promote books I haven't read yet. But I'm sure it's excellent because, God and Cosmos was so good. It was more of an abductive or inductive version where they basically try to deal with all the naturalistic theories of ethics, and then they show why the theistic version or the theistic explanation is better. And and I love their approach because they say, and it almost is a similar move now that I think about it to the problem of evil for atheist argument, because basically they want to say that our world has a lot of resources for explaining morality. We have personal relationships, there's suffering, like, when you hit someone, it hurts. And so you shouldn't do that because you don't like being hurt. And so there are a lot of resources that can kind of help someone come to some kind of ethical truth from their experience or from the things that they see around them. However, they want to say that they don't go far enough. Like the resources don't go far enough to give you a fully robust explanation of ethics. And so they want to give the naturalists some credit and say, yeah, you can explain some parts of ethics with just the world around us, with just the naturalistic resources. But if you want a fully robust explanation, you're going to need to bring in God and his love and his goodness.
That's great. Yep.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a similar move that I'm seeing quite often, is that for us theists, we have just more resources available to us. For the naturalists, they want to say the world is all there is. And so for the theists, we can kind of say, yeah, those are great resources, but that's a part of our worldview too. And so we'll take all those and then we'll add on top of that. And ultimately, like in principle, a lot of times have better explanations. So I think it's really good. Well, Christopher, I really appreciate you coming on. This has really been a blast. And I really enjoy these kinds of conversations. Is there anywhere people can find you? Again, I'm going to put your channel down below, but is there anything else that people can go consume from you?
There's, I would just say go to my YouTube channel. So Christopher Michael Cloos, and it's at Dr. Cloos. So Dr. Cloos, Cloos. So go check out my YouTube channel, and that's sort of the hub. And then I'm going to be, this is just kind of a preview, but I'm going to be working on a guide on divine hiddenness that I'll have on my website. So it'll be christophercloos.com, and it'll have like the best responses to the hiddenness argument, sort of simplified and broken down. And then I plan on doing a course as well called Divine Hiddenness Defeated. So kind of keep an eye out for that as well.
Oh, that'll be cool. So website, YouTube channel, go check out Christopher's channel. It is awesome. I promise you, if you've enjoyed this conversation today, if you've made it this far, I promise you'll like his channel. Go check it out. Thank you so much once again, Christopher, for coming on. And
you're welcome. Thank you, Nathan, for having me. This has been really fun.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And, guys, do all the YouTube stuff, like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff, share, and we'll see you guys in the next one.